Welcome, everybody, to Policy Driven, a podcast on global transport policy. My name is Thomas Jérémy Lefebvre, and I'm joined by my co-host, Mark Watts, and our guest, Julia Poliscanova.
Hi, everyone.
Good to see you again, Tom, and welcome, Julia.
Really good to be here. Thanks a lot for having me.
Mark, why don't you introduce yourself to our audiences? It's only our second policy-driven podcast.
Sure, I'll keep it brief, but I think probably those that are watching this are most interested in our transport experience and maybe a European experience. So, I mean, unbelievably, when I left university, my first job was with the GLC in London on banning lorries in London, or the nighttime lorry ban, which was one of the first global attempts to restrict lorries. Mixed views on that, I think, how that worked out, but it was a really great experience. Then I joined a local authority in London on transport policy, and then quite bizarrely, unexpectedly, got elected to the European Parliament, where I served for 10 years on the TRAN committee. And that was like 20 years in local government and European politics. So that I reached my limit. I think I would always recommend people not to do a lifetime in politics. And then after I left the European Parliament, I went back into the world of transport and working for public and private sector organizations, particularly on European advocacy, trying to develop European-wide and indeed international transport policy. Because I think what I realized is you can do a lot at local level, a huge amount. But at the end of the day, the rules, the global rules that set the balance, if you like, between competing interests are best decided internationally. Biggest regrets is the real, and we come on to this, I hope, lack of real modal shift. I've always believed in modal shift, getting people, we'll come on to this, like out of their cars into public transport, walking and cycling. On the other hand, huge improvements I'm very proud of in safety in aviation, shipping in particular, but also on the roads as well. Road safety has been transformed in just 20, 30 years. You know, I think in Europe, we had about 50,000 people killed in Europe 30 years ago a year, 50,000 people killed every year on the roads. Now it's 20,000, still a grotesque amount. But it shows you the power of public policy. And I guess that's what I'm here to sort of share and have hopefully a very invigorating conversation with yourself, Tom, and Julia.
That sounds absolutely excellent. On my side, my career is not as long as yours. All I've done up to now is start a magazine.
Because you're a young man, Tom.
A young man. The world is my oyster.
Exactly.
But for those who are just joining us, my name is Thomas. I'm the editor. I'm the founder, I should say, and then the editor-in-chief of the Green Mobility magazine, a focus on the EU. I want to hint at something, which is our next annual magazine is coming out very, very soon. And whilst Julia is not present in this issue, her colleagues are with some very interesting content. So we very much look forward to publishing that soon. And Julia, you're the person of the hour. Why don't you tell us a bit about yourself, how you got interested in transport and sustainability, perhaps even where you're from and how you got to where you are right now.
No, absolutely. So my transport or climate career also started in London, like Mark's. I myself come from Latvia, but I was studying in London. And like so many young people at the time, I got into climate and energy. You know, climate and energy were hot topics already back in 2005, which is when I was at university. And then when it came to my last year's thesis, coming from Latvia, the topic of energy security was always really important to me. This was the topic, you know, on the minds in Eastern Europe decades before it became a hot topic in Western Europe. So I wrote my thesis on how Europe can be independent from Russia using renewables, energy efficiency, and that's how I also came to electric vehicles, right? So anything we do that relies on electricity, so homegrown energy, some people call it freedom energy even, is better than relying on someone else's fossil fuels when you don't have them. I mean, we still import hundreds of billions worth of fossil fuels, including from Russia even today, but there has been a lot of progress, of course. So that's how I came to this field, and that's how I got excited about all things renewables and electric vehicles. And then I came to Brussels, got an internship with a British Liberal member of the European Parliament. So I worked there for many years, and that's how I came across also TNE, actually. And I worked with them on the first car CO2 standard. So the first EV policy in Europe now, gosh, almost 2 decades ago. It's embarrassing to say my journey with automotive industry started a long time ago. I don't think of myself as that old, but maybe I should reconsider that statement. But I worked on that first standard, and I just really like the approach of the organization. Yes, it's an NGO. I now spent a decade actually with TNE, but what I find really exciting about us as TNE is that we're really solutions driven. We really focus on solutions, on policies, on how get stuff done, rather than talking about the problem all day long. And that's why I can really be in this organization, and today also be in the management of the organization.
That sounds really interesting.
Just to say, fascinating. I think particularly you're thinking about energy security. I think it obviously resonates now, Julia, but I had no idea really that was being thought of. Obviously, again, that's part of the problem. I think those of us, if you like, in some parts of Europe, took a very, very parochial view of the rest of Europe, Eastern Central Europe, before accession, and indeed the rest of the world. I think we've been complacent. We've been lazy intellectually, if you like. We've relied on the international fossil fuel, including from Russia. And so it's fascinating that people like yourself were really trying to pioneer this thinking of energy security that long ago, and I think we should learn the lesson from that we can't afford any longer to be parochial or not thinking about the future a lot more. So great to have you here to share that lesson with us all, because I still think, to be honest, we're still repeating the mistakes of the past, and we still haven't fully understood this lesson. You think during COVID or during the obviously now during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, we would have learned the lesson. I'm still not completely sure we have.
No, indeed, and I think what and there's so many parallels to even broader clean energy transition today, right? It's just so easy, and I think Western Europe for a very long time relied on cheap Russian gas, and they were like, right, it's abundant, it's there, it's easy. What's the problem? The problem is that sometimes it's there, and other times when someone doesn't want to, they close the taps. And you can draw similar parallels with clean tech today, because some people say, well, can't we just import all those cheap electric cars, cheap solar and cheap batteries from China? We can today, but who is to guarantee that in the next decade, China or any other country for that matter, doesn't just decide to finish those imports or make them more expensive? Not being resilient has a really huge cost, has a really huge risk. And indeed, it is frustrating how reluctant and slow we always are in Europe to just realize that. And I do think that the US has been better at understanding that for a while now.
Julia, I want to talk very briefly a bit more about your past before we go into the news of the day. And one question I had is, how did someone originally from Latvia end up in the UK? I realized Latvia and the UK were both European Union members at the time, so there's an ease of movement. But why London out of all the cities in the world?
Yes, look, it's such a good question. I love big cities, and I think London is just the city that epitomizes for me what I love, theater, museums, all that thing you can have there. But I was very young. I won some English competition in Latvia. I was number one in Latvia in my English knowledge.
Congratulations.
When I was about 13, and I won a free trip to Crystal Palace, out of all the places in the world. I don't know how many people know, Mark, you probably know where it is, but it's just a random area south in London, in the south of London. And I went there for a few weeks to stay with the host family, improve my English, and I met a bunch of people, and I just fell in love with London, the life and the mix and the multiculturalism of it all. So I've always wanted to go to London. So when I finished my school in Latvia, I just applied like crazy to all London universities that would take me. Not many did, but one did accept me, Goldsmiths, and I just finished there. And from then onwards, it's a bit of a love affair, really, with everything English, I have to say. My partner is British. Most of my friends are British, so it's just something I like. All these people complaining about Brexit, I was like, doesn't matter. England is the best.
But the question is, Tom, why didn't you move to London? I was born in London. I had the privilege of growing up in London, going to university there as well, working there for a time. Why weren't you drawn to London?
I did live in London for 3 years. I'd like to remind you. I did live in London. I did part of my studies there, but I have to admit, I don't think I lived in the UK during its best moment, which was between 2019 and 2023. So you had COVID plus Brexit, which meant that I couldn't even go to the theater, unfortunately. It was unlawful to do so at one point. And then it wasn't, but I still didn't really want to go. I think the UK has a lot to offer. And, fundamentally, this brings me on to my news of the day, which, I realize we all share this UK connection. For some of you, it's stronger. Julia and Mark. Mark, you originally being from the UK, and Julia, well, having studied and now having a partner based in the UK. But as you might be aware, the UK has been making a handful of announcements when it comes to sustainable transportation, even since it left the European Union. For instance, in late March this year, so not more than a month ago, the UK announced an ambitious new maritime strategy outlining its goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by 2030, which is just 5 years' time, and 80% by 2040, and to zero by 2050. This aligns with the highest levels of ambition set by the International Maritime Organization. The maritime sector is not the only one. The aviation industry as well. The UK has implemented an ambitious sustainable aviation fuel mandate, which starts small at 22% of total UK jet fuel demand by 2040, but goes all the way up to 80%. By 22% of total UK jet fuel by 2040. And in the car sector, 80% of new cars and 70% of new vans sold in Great Britain will have to be zero emissions by 2030, increasing to 100% by 2035. According to current plans. So my questions for both of you, Anglophiles, if you will, is do you think that post-Brexit Britain can really serve as a driver and perhaps even a model on global transport decarbonization? Or is it a little bit all pie in the sky? Julia.
Yeah, look, I think it's a really great question. What I would say is rather than just any post-Brexit Britain, the current Britain under the Labour government definitely, has the potential to really be a progressive force in Europe, but also globally. So it's clear that it's an opportunity. It's a real opportunity. You mentioned aviation. You mentioned maritime. I would add to this also the most ambitious electric car policy, actually globally, I believe. So the so-called ZEV mandate, zero emission vehicle mandate today in the UK, mandates each year an increased a target for electric cars, new electric car sales for all manufacturers. And by 2030, that target is 80%. This is the most ambitious target globally in 2030, to really have 80% of vehicles largely electric. It can also be hydrogen if it ever happens, for example. But that's really, really ambitious. There are a bunch of flexibilities there, of course, but generally it's a great policy. What is also really great to see is these targets are being met. So manufacturers did meet last year's target, and as a result, not only electric car sales grew in the UK, the overall car market grew in the UK in 2024. So it's an overall growth strategy as well, and I think that's really great. But just to maybe nuance it a little bit, having said all of that, the UK is still in the global context, the context of the geopolitics we're in, of the competitiveness and the simplification drive we're in, just like in the rest of Europe. So we are seeing changing dynamics. For example, truck decarbonization policy is delayed in the UK. We were expecting to have similar zero emission mandates announced for trucks. They're still not there. And just this week, in fact, the government announced also more flexibilities, some of that actual weakening to the existing EV targets that I mentioned, right? So the dynamics, while it's overall positive, it's still all moving in the same direction as it does in other countries. I don't know, Mark, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I'm inspired to listen to you and hear your take on it, because I think you come from an organisation that is often very objective, shall we say, and I think to give that green light to the UK's approach, I think is very, very encouraging, and indeed, like I said, inspiring, because it's a world leader. I think those of us from the UK, we're always a little bit cynical. Yeah, we're English, so we're always a bit cynical. The government says this, but it's not always that good. But yeah, it's refreshing. The UK is a leader. I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating, particularly on maritime and aviation. I think they have the challenge that everyone else in the world has in terms of the availability of sustainable fuels, for example. Personally, though, I think post-Brexit, and we are in a post-Brexit era, those of us that want the UK to rejoin, that's not going to happen anytime soon. Personally, I think it's a matter for the next generation to resolve that issue. So how can we make the system work best now, Julia and Tom? I would say actually have the best of both worlds, have the UK and the EU working together to push forward the decarbonisation agenda, particularly in EVs, for example. I know T&E has been advocating this partnership between the UK and the EU for EVs and the battery supply chain. I think that's exactly what we should be doing. So we combine the best of both worlds and we can both be global leaders. And to be honest, that's desperately what we need.
What you mentioned though, Julia, that it was the Labour government, and I think I would agree with that. But my question to both of you is, what happens if there is a change of government? Is there a possibility that, I guess it could happen anywhere, but in the European member states, because these mandates come from the top, it's a bit harder to seek derogations. But what happens if the Tories come back in power in the UK? Do you think, before Brexit, they were generally in favor of these ambitious mandates? They saw it, I think, as an industrial policy lever. But how about in a world of simplification and deregulation? Would a Conservative Party still maintain that line?
Mark, do you want to go first? And I can.
Yeah, sure. Well, obviously we don't want to get too political, because you can imagine what I think about the Tories ever returning to power in the UK. And to be honest, at the moment, that's probably not likely, because almost reform seems to be eating into their base. But to be honest, I would say this in a more sort of cross-party way. To be honest, these matters should be matters of cross-party interest, and there should be a national consensus. And to be fair, the Tories started the progress that we're seeing now. Labour have intensified it. Of course, there's mutterings it might change or you might delay. I don't think anyone is seriously talking about upending Britain's transition to zero carbon by 2050, if not before. And I think we have to work really hard to take on board everyone and make sure we use the phrase "no one should be left behind." And I think personally that for me is the real issue here. And I know I bang on about it, but I think just as we want to decarbonize society, we also need to build social justice, because that's what's really undermining for example, the EV transition in the UK, and indeed I would argue elsewhere. It's not the decarbonization policy. It's the lack of good social policies. It's the lack of caring for each other, of solidarity, of welfare, and creative economies that help people go from welfare into work. So that's where we've got to work harder in the UK, I think, because there is a big gap between Labour and the Tories on those welfare issues. But I think both sides know we have to tackle it. But there's too many people dependent on welfare. There's lack of job opportunities for various reasons. So I would say on that one, I'm an optimist. I think in the long run, Britain has to solve its problems, but the only way to do that is to almost not dismantle the two-party system, but have a more consensual political system in the UK. So those are my thoughts on that.
Maybe just to add to that, I think it's just important to remind to all the listeners that actually the government or the person that put in place the now famous ZEV mandate in the UK was Boris Johnson, right? It was actually done under the previous Tory government. Yeah. We all can have opinions about Boris, and I'm not defending Boris, but it just shows that this is not about a political party. And as you were saying, Mark, it's really about the right direction, the right political economy around this as well. If there is industry, if there are investments, if car makers are going electric, Tory government will support that as well. Actually, they will simply support what makes sense, and I think that's what I do think can change the course in the UK, even under the current Labour government, is what happens in the rest of Europe. So there is a huge debate in the EU today to actually revamp and weaken its 2035 engine phase-out decision. So Europe wanted, or still wants, technically, if you look at the laws, to have only zero-emission cars or cars with zero CO2 emissions, basically a tailpipe, sold after 2035. And there's also more progressive targets, for example, by 2030 to get there by 2035. But there's been huge pushback from the industry, and the Commission has already confirmed that they will review this 2035 engine phase out later this year. And I do believe that if the EU weakens their standard, there will be similar push from the industry on the UK government, and it will be very difficult for the UK government, given the current dynamics with US, with tariffs, with China, to resist that. And I think they will give in, and they will also follow the rest of the EU, and they might also do that. So that's where I'm really concerned. What really happens on this in the EU, and what ramifications it has for the UK stance on this.
It seems that we're now in a dynamic where if Europe sneezes, Britain now gets the cold, which might not have always been the case. Before we really dive into this automotive, these changes happening in the European automotive space, I'd like to ask, do you think that other OECD countries outside the EU or the US, the two largest global Western economies, such as Japan, South Korea, Canada, or Australia, and of course the UK, can also offer lessons to the larger economies? Or do you believe that there are a relative lack of perhaps industrial capacity, political will, international sway will always make them rule takers rather than rule makers? Mark? Or
okay,
Julia?
I'll go first, but I think the world's changing. We know that it's changing faster maybe than ever before. I think this is a huge opportunity. Come back to my point about collaboration. I would love to see Canada, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, EU, UK, and all those want to pursue progressive transport policies, environment policies, energy policies to work together. I think that's the answer. Collaboration with whoever shares our values. And I think this idea of just doing stuff on your own, yes, there is a point to that, and I think Julia's right about energy security in particular, but where you can forge close relationships with people with like-minded values and objectives, that's got to be a good thing too. Okay, you can't over-rely on that either, but there's that sweet spot between security and collaboration that empowers these smaller countries as well, because I think they've got great assets as well. They've got a lot to offer. Just as the UK is a relatively small market, but it punches well above its weight really, and it's certainly in this energy transition sector. And I think all these other countries have a huge opportunity too. So I think the future is collaboration. I know I probably sound completely offline, mad, if not mad, given what's going on in the world. But I think they're the two choices we face. You either just look after yourself, and I think we need to do that more in terms of energy security. But when it comes to global trade, I would like to see us working more closely with those that share our values. Now that means we have to be a bit selective, because obviously some countries don't necessarily share our values. But the countries you've mentioned, at least, it's a win-win.
A coalition of the willing, perhaps, to use terms from before.
I think Europe is trying. With some of them, Europe is really trying. What I would add to that, I think if we really look, I agree, and I think the time for more collaboration will come again. We'll do a circle, and we'll come to that again. But I think if you specifically look in the current geopolitical environment and competition to secure those green supply chains, be it batteries or critical minerals, the countries you mentioned, be it Canada, Australia, South Korea, has actually a lot to offer. Within the battery supply chain, Canada and Australia have so many critical minerals. Australia with lithium, of course, but not only. Canada with nickel. All those things we need to build those batteries actually exist in those countries. If we look at places like South Korea or even Japan, there's a lot of battery expertise. South Korea really makes a lot of batteries and battery components as well, like cathodes. They can do that. They have the capacity. They have the know-how. So I think there's actually a lot that we can build on. And I do think that this bloc does not have to be a rule taker. One thing to really underline here is what these nations, including the EU together, have is a really attractive market. We have the market, we have the demand. And this is something that, for example, China struggles with. They have issues with consumption domestically. So access to global markets, especially to large markets like the EU, Japan, etc., is very important to them. So this is the leverage. This is the card I think we're not playing enough today to actually be more of a rule maker in the world.
Yeah,
using our market to our advantage.
Really good point. Just Tom, if I can just sort of follow, I think this conversation is really, really important. But again, I don't want to disagree with you, Tom. But I think also the way we frame this, we also have to be mindful that there's huge parts of the world where we have common interests too, and I'm talking about North Africa, the Middle East, Central and South America, and indeed the whole of Africa itself. I don't think we should just be exclusive, if you like, to sort of the old world and our English-speaking allies, if you like. I think the work the EU is doing in Central and South America is hugely important. Brokering new relationships with them, trading relationships. Same with Asia and with Africa too. So I don't think we should be. I should think, like I said, the rule should be: do they share our values? Do we have a common agenda? Do we want to get to the same destination? And if people do, we should work with them. And indeed, I think we should deepen our connections with those that we haven't really built strong enough connections with. And all the countries I've mentioned, for example, huge potential there as well. Like I said, we need to think out of the box. We really do. The world is changing, and we've really got to get out of our comfort zone and start thinking in a very, very different way.
Speaking of getting out of our comfort zone, I'd like us to move on to our main story of the day, which is the EU strategic dialogue on the automotive sector. Julia, you've been working, as you said, on automotive issues for the past 10 years, if I'm not mistaken, and you've been following this closely, perhaps more closely than Mark and I. Very simply, how did we get here? What happened 5-10 years ago, and what happened over the summer?
Yes, well, automotive is a long story in the EU, like I'm sure it is in many other places. Look, about 20 years ago now, actually, the EU started thinking about putting in place its first ever CO2 standard to drive car makers to invest in cleaner engines and cleaner vehicles. I would argue that the first meaningful CO2 standard that really drove electrification came into force in 2020. So we started a long time ago, but we got there by 2020. The famous 95-gram target that really drove so much of the EV market and investment that we have today. In fact, in 2020, because of that standard, was the one year when Europe or the EU overtook China on the size of its EV market. It didn't happen since. Now then we have CO2 standards for 2025, 2030, and the 100% CO2 reduction by 2035 that I mentioned. The problem in Europe, even though we have those standards and they work, the problem is that they are in 5-year intervals. What this means is that while in the background a lot of preparation and investment is happening, in the in-between years, so for example, between 2021 and 2025, car makers do not put so much effort into selling new EV models or bringing new electric car models on the market. So there is stagnation. There's just expensive models everywhere because they're thinking of profits rather than really transitioning to EVs. And we are seeing the same dynamics happening every 5 years. So back in 2019, even though car makers were preparing, they were all complaining and trying to delay the 2020 standard, because of course that will be the hit on their profit margins. They can't sell all the SUVs that they want. And we saw exactly the same in last year. By the end of last year, the car industry accelerated their push, saying, look, no one wants to buy an EV. We can't possibly meet the standards. You have to weaken them, right? So this is what was happening, and it's a structural problem with the way regulation works in the EU. As I said, it happens every 5 years. If you look into the detail, the price of the electric vehicle in Europe in 2024 was 45,000 euros. You tell me what is the demand for a 45,000 car, right? However, this year they were all planning to bring on board affordable models, and they're coming. And the market is growing, and I will share with you some stats about that. But the point is that they used that momentum while the market was stagnating. Everyone like TNE and other academics all actually said the market will stagnate in 2024. And the market stagnated. But the car makers used it as a momentum, right? Look, people are not buying cars, and you have to change the standards. What has been different this time is that this has coincided with much harsher geopolitics. So it is true that we are losing car market in China, because Chinese are simply so excellent at electric vehicle technology and we're behind that no one wants to buy German electric cars in China. And at the same time, overarching in Europe and in the global economy, we're having restructuring. People are buying less cars. So car makers are undergoing difficult times. So all of this came together, the regulatory problems, the perfect geopolitical storm that really gave strong arguments to the car industry vis-a-vis European decision makers to say, look, this is not working, we need help. So what the Commission decided to do, and the new Commission was actually sworn, on the promise of competitiveness and working with industry, they decided to follow the example of actually the agriculture sector, where we saw the first structural dialogue, but follow that example and kick off a similar process with the car industry and all the stakeholders, so as TNE, we were also part of that strategic dialogue, to rediscuss the regulations and see what can be done. So this is how we got here.
I want to take a step back and look at this 5-year new standards every single 5 years. Is this something that you actively advocated against when they were drafting the law? And
Absolutely.
what were the arguments in favor of this 5-year system?
Absolutely. So we always supported annual targets, or if not, at least biannual targets, because we always see the risk of, you have this stagnation and then you have a big jump. And indeed, the jump is quite painful because you have to go from quite low level to higher level. And in the UK, also in the US, you actually do have more granular standards. In China as well, the standards are a lot more frequent than every 5 years. What car makers always said is that they want flexibility. They said, look, we want flexibility how we, plan investments. And what they always told us, please don't worry, TNE, we will not be doing this jump. We will be naturally going down this slope to 5 years. But this is it's not happening in the market. We follow the market, almost every month. And we see that at least in Europe today, EV sales are completely regulation driven. So if they don't have to sell them, they don't sell them. And they do sell them literally. They start rolling out models a few months before the targets enter force. And a really good, we see that today in the market. You don't believe me, don't believe TNE, look at the market. We had no affordable European EV models under 25K up until the end of 2024. This year, a dozen of Europe-made affordable models are coming to the market. Why in 2025? Why not in 2024? Well, because they do have to accelerate EV sales this year.
And this is what I don't understand, if I may say so, because in the intervening period, there is obviously demand for affordable EVs. So what have people done? Consumers have bought American to some extent, but particularly Chinese cars, yeah. And the citizens aren't going to wait. They want their EV that's affordable now, and they have started to buy these imported Chinese EVs on a massive scale. To me, it looks pretty massive.
Exactly.
So what I don't understand, Julia, is like this seems to be such a bad business for the European auto industry. I mean, they could have sold those affordable EVs before now, yeah. So I mean, I understand your critique, and I agree with it, but what explains the sort of business failure of the European auto industry not to buy into that market earlier? I mean, why would they want to delay? I mean, they're all grumbling and complaining now that they're struggling. Well, no wonder they're struggling, because they're not producing the products at the price or quality the consumer wants. Isn't that a business failure?
Yes, I think what explains it is, and it's a broader issue in the West, is that our business decisions are driven by short-term shareholder interest, right? So it's about making profit in 1 year, then the next year, then the year after. It's not about thinking 5 or 10 years ahead, which is how a completely different economic system, I understand, works in China, for example, right? They don't mind so much whether or not they make profit from year one to the next, right? They're about capturing the market in the future. It's a longer term vision that comes from the government. We don't have that. And it's this short term profits driven strategy, which underpins Western businesses all across for decades, that really prevents that. But having said that, I think we also have to be fair and honest also to our car makers. The point is that the Chinese and with their policies started building this entire supply chain a lot earlier. So while a Chinese manufacturer, vertically integrated with access to raw materials, can bring or could and did bring an affordable, cheap EV to Europe in 2023 or 2024, the Europeans were not there. They started late, But the reality is that because they didn't master this supply chain, their costs were indeed higher. It is true, but it is changing right now. The dynamics is really changing. Battery prices are down. Critical mineral prices have really collapsed in the last year or even year and a half. And this makes it a lot easier today for everybody to bring much more affordable EV to the market. Right. So there's also this wider dynamics that the Chinese are more competitive and they can sell that product at a much cheaper price. Also, thanks to national subsidies, of course, in China, but not only. It's also largely thanks, in my view, to the scale and the early investments, not only subsidies. It's not as simple. But this is also part of this, of course.
Julia, you mentioned the perfect storm, which coincided with this review and the lobbying that was being undertaken by the automotive industry, namely ASEA and others as well. But I've been surprised at how successful they've been in their advocacy efforts. As you might be aware, there was in-person events in Brussels, which was very unique for EU affairs, and they basically got what they wanted with the strategic dialogue. My question is, do you think there's something really special about cars that makes stakeholders listen? Or is it just really that perfect geopolitical storm coinciding with poor 2024 commercial results?
Look, some people say that automakers in Europe is the same as the oil industry in the US. For us in Europe, it's simply the most powerful industrial sector that we have. If you look at Europe's GDP, and in some countries it's even higher, but cars or the car industry is the single largest contributor. I think it's somewhere between 7 or 8% of GDP. So it's simply a really powerful sector in Europe. And what is interesting is beyond just that, in the biggest countries in Europe, so Germany and France, is where we have the biggest manufacturers. So those manufacturers are strong in the largest countries, and those large countries and their capitals and their governments are the strongest in Europe. So that is really the first answer to you. But I don't think it is the only answer, because what is interesting, if I ask anyone, you do because you're experts. But if I ask anyone on the street, no one knows what's happening in the trucking policy or the maritime policy, but everyone knows about cars because cars are in people's life. It's something is very tangible. We care, we buy them, we know them. The amount of conversations I had in Ubers, taxis, train stations, and just friends' dinners about electric cars is incredible. I was struggling to pass my driving test actually recently, embarrassingly. I kept failing. It was in Brussels. It's a nightmare to drive in Brussels. Right. And then on the third time I went, and my examinator was sitting there, and he started chatting to my instructor about how he wants to buy an electric car, and he's thinking which one. So obviously it's something I know about. So I got involved. I gave him some advice, and his respect grew, and I passed the test.
Well done.
Cars in our society, they just have power over people.
Yeah, just to give a sort of a comment on that, and not that I want to disagree with Julia, but I think it's also a symptom of we are in a bit of a bubble, and I think you are largely right, Julia. EVs do dominate the narrative, but there's also a huge amount of our society that actually don't have a car and can't afford an EV at the moment, and I think we've got to include them, and hence my passion from leaving university for public transport, walking and cycling. That the most unglamorous sector of all for transport is probably bus policy, but that's probably the most popular mode that people without a car use. They use buses day in and day out to get to work, to get their kids to school, to get their medical appointments, etc. Where is the bus lobby in Brussels? There isn't one really, and I think that's one of the problems that we as policymakers, if you like, have to sort of rebalance the lobby so we do give a voice to those that either don't want to use a car, can't afford to use a car at the moment, that do rely on public transport, that feel, as increasingly it's a them and us, that somehow we're focusing on the EV users, but what about the bus users who across many countries in Europe and the world are suffering for worse services because they so often rely on public subsidy. So that's my concern always about EU transport policy, is it doesn't focus in a proportionate way on the full spectrum of transport users. I mean, it's only in recent years really they've been focusing on walking and cycling, for example. I mean, they used to just ignore it 10 years ago. It's starting to happen. But I think we as public policy professionals ought to say, hang on a minute, yes, let's focus on EV and the decarbonisation of cars, but let's not at the same time leave behind the bus user, the train user, the cyclist, and the pedestrian.
So I agree with you, Mark. I do agree. But I think the reason why this is happening, and I know it's maybe a bit legalistic and boring, but this is due to the competencies the European level has versus the national level versus the local level. At the European level, there's clear competence to regulate what products are put on the market and to regulate sectors like automotive or shipping. So the EU actually has power to change the car industry, which I think is amazing, and it's what we should be using. If you, and we do, as TNE, we have a whole clean cities program across largest European cities. So we work a lot on the topics you are mentioning, but the level and the power to change those things lies with local, national as well, of course, but local governments. So there is a bus lobby, but it's lobbying your Greater London Authority, for example, or the Manchester Greater Authority. There's also a very big non-car user lobby today, cyclists, etc. But they're largely working with local governments to put in place infrastructure, for example, where Europe can come in. I think Europe can really unlock investment and finance for all of that to happen, right? But the actual policy to promote that will be different from city to city, and it stays with city mayors, which I believe is correct. And that's why at European level, we can talk about it if we like, but there's not actually so many powers have to change anything.
Although I think it was the European Committee of the Regions was quite critical of the EU's automotive policy because it doesn't really mention regions or cities. And I think there is still that frustration that you're absolutely right, Julia. There's a limit to what EU can do because of their legal competence. But I think there's just a feeling there's a bit of a blind spot when it comes to cities and regions that the EU just doesn't focus. So the cohesion funds, for example, innovation fund, or indeed the CAP, though, actually it's about leveraging the money maybe in a different way in the future to give more support to all transport modes. And I think we're both on the same page there in terms of basically transport's got to become a higher priority in EU finance from whatever source. That's probably the most important thing, and I'm optimistic that the new Sustainable Transport and Tourism Commissioner, Zizi Costas, will get a larger share of the EU funding cake, because we've been underfunding transport generally for years in Europe, and that's one of the reasons we're in the mess we're in.
Mark, you mentioned funding, and so did you, Julia. And that brings me on to a topic which I'd love to hear your thoughts on, which is the European Commission, whilst arguably watering down CO2 regulations and the ambition of the car, the decarbonization of automotive manufacturers, they have proposed a battery booster package, which seeks to support battery manufacturing under the Innovation Fund, exploring EU direct production support criteria for companies producing batteries in the EU, possibly combined with state aid and other tools. Do you think that it is right for Europe to be seeking battery production in the EU, or should we really be seeking to import it from our friends in South Korea and Japan, for instance?
So for me, the answer to your question is a resounding yes. It is right for Europe to onshore at least part of this value chain locally for our resilience, for security reasons. I think it's just important to understand that in the energy transition, the battery is almost an 80% solution. It is not only about decarbonizing transport. So yes, we will need it to decarbonize cars, buses, trucks, vans. A lot of them should be shared, but nonetheless, they should be electric. Now there's even forays into electric ships, by the way, and planes. But it is also what you need to go to 100% renewable power system. You can't do it without storage, without batteries, right? So it's such a huge part of the energy transition piece, and not having any capacities or expertise in making batteries and components that go into them puts Europe at an enormous risk. We can't not be able to make batteries. It doesn't mean we have to be self-sufficient completely 100%. That's different. There's space for trade, for collaboration, but we need to bring those expertise here. It also doesn't mean that it needs to be a European company. It's not about the nationality of the manufacturer. It's about the location. We need to have it here. I also believe that decarbonization decarbonization should not result in deindustrialization. And this is where the new jobs are, right? So the answer is yes. Now, if I can just spend a minute or two on how, because this is where the battery booster comes in. There are a lot of good ideas there, a lot. My issue with that is that they remain vague. And it's sentences like, we will look into. European battery companies are going bust. It's time to, stop looking
They have
into
gone bust.
doing,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
So that's the problem. So in terms of how, let me just outline maybe two or three things that we've been focusing on, and that you can see from me, I feel very passionate about building that industry in Europe. First of all, this is where the mistake in the automotive plan comes in, and the mistake is to weaken or make more flexible the car CO2 rules. Because the first thing you need in a big European market is investment certainty for battery players to invest to make batteries here. If you are not sure and not clear what will be the size of the EV market, why would you invest? So changing the rules halfway through the game is not okay, because it actually really undermines some of the investments. Largest European battery manufacturer today is LG Energy Solutions in Poland, and their CEO was quite clear. He said, if Europe really now dismantles its 2035 CO2 standard framework, I don't think I will be expanding my facility on my battery factory in Europe. Why would I? There's no certainty of investment. So I think that's really important. So keeping the standard is key. But beyond that, it's not enough, of course. We need more. And that's where Battery Booster actually, I believe, talks about at the right policy measures. The first one being production aid, as it's called, or investment support to scale manufacturing. This is what the US Inflation Reduction Act that was announced under Biden was doing. So we need to move beyond just innovation and research funding. It's of course very important, but we also need to support scaling, producing kilograms of green hydrogen or kilowatt hours of batteries. And that kind of support, it does not exist today in Europe. So that's what we need. And the second thing I believe we need is some sort of local preference. Now, if any of you are free traders, you hate the word local content requirements. I know that. In Europe, it was a swear word for decades. But if you look at every region, I today work a lot with partners in South Africa, in India, in Brazil. Everyone has some sort of local content requirement, because you want, as part of this green transition, to attract new jobs, new businesses. And in the beginning, the way to do it is simply by requiring products or parts of them to be made locally. So I think we need to move to some sort of local requirements. It can be done in many ways, but this is something that we're missing right now. It's just too cheap too easy to import everything, for example, from China in the case of batteries, so no one bothers. If we were to require things to be made locally, for example, to access subsidies, it would really change the dynamics, and there will be a lot more investment interest into the EU, I believe.
Mark, I want to push you on one subject, because you were a former S&D MEP, so on the left of the center. What do you think of using public funds to support these private companies? Because if you're a true free marketeer, this doesn't really make sense. Businesses should be investing for their own benefit. What do you think about that?
The world's a complex place. I mean, I am a free marketeer, but I think that you've also got to be pragmatic. And as Julia said, there are times, there are moments in history where you have to depart from some of your overall principles and be pragmatic, and targeted public investment, even in private companies, is at times required. It's been required throughout our history. We haven't hesitated in the past when we rebuilt Europe after the Second World War. Massive public finance to the private sector. Building actually the European automobile industry was largely publicly financed after the Second World War, a lot of American money as well. Then they got on their own 2 feet, and they sustained themselves until now. And I think we've reached one of those periods in our history when we need private finance, so public finance for the private sector. But I think it should be conditional. I mean, partly, as Julia said, there should be a preference. I don't think it should be a complete procurement ban on buying things from outside the EU, but there should be preferences, particularly if it's public subsidy, to buy at least a limited amount of publicly procured products from the EU or from their localities. Also, I think the quality of standards of their product, that we shouldn't lower and diminish our quality standards. There's a push for that now. I think that would be a mistake. Just as Julia said about the need for certainty and continuity of existing regulations, and also things like the jobs and the wages of the employees. Again, we shouldn't dilute those. There's a push that we need to be more competitive at the expense of low-paid workers. Again, I think we should protect them. So yes, Thomas, I think on this one you've got to be ruthlessly pragmatic. Give money to companies that otherwise should need it, because we're facing an economic crisis now, and those are the moments the state has to step in. How do I rationalize that as a free marketeer? Because this is market failure. The market is failing. Simple as that. If you read your Adam Smith, this is what's happening now, and you have to step in. Good old-fashioned classical capitalism. I know it's odd that a former member of the S&D would advocate for that, but there comes moments in our history when the socialists have to save capitalism, and this is one of them. We have to step in to save the capitalists from themselves. Personally, I would go even further than Julia, and I think Northvolt, for example, is an absolute disgrace. Absolute disgrace. It's shameful. We as Europeans have let that company fail. My own personal view as a former member of S&D is nationalize it. The state should have stepped in, taken that over, and said to Northvolt and their management, if you can't run a battery factory in 2025, step aside, because we will. And I think that's the ruthless approach we need to take, ruthlessly pragmatic. The market failure is not acceptable in the energy transition, the decarbonisation transition, and we should use all the tools in the toolkit to make this happen.
Julia, coming from a post-communist world, I think we will need another hour to debate whether nationalization of companies is always an efficient policy, but that's a debate for another day.
That's another podcast. But what's happening in the UK is very interesting, as I say, with our railway companies, where we literally are seeing market failure, and the state is once again nationalising Britain's railway companies. I mean, it's quite amazing. I just think we need another conversation,
another conversation indeed on that one.
But exactly. It is a tool in the toolkit, and sometimes you just have to use it.
Julia, I want to please.
No, just to add on Northvolt, I do agree with you on Northvolt. I think it's a failure of our public policy that we let the company fail. Yes, mistakes were made, but as you are rolling out a completely new product, there will be failures. You're learning. That's just part of it, right? But I think indeed what in my view, nationalization, is one, but another route could have been to force or require that company to work together with those that know how to do it, right? So there's plenty of Chinese and South Korean investment in the EU making batteries. If we had a policy that they're required to enter a joint venture with a local player, and as part of that, the local player like Northvolt can learn, we could have actually avoided that, because that was really their problem. And I know that there's a few other companies, European companies in the pipeline, by the way, with similar problems. They're really failing to scale at the quality required. They have really high scrap rates. That's the biggest issue. And other companies went through that 10 years ago, and they can teach us how to do this. But we need policy to require, not just open the market, everyone comes in and assembles batteries here. We don't want to be an assembly plant. Can we learn from those investments? And I think that's another policy right now that we're missing in Europe.
Julia, I have one final question for you, because I'm cognizant of time, and that is, in light of these multiple market failures and diminishing international trade environment, if you will, EU is poised to react to the US president's imposition of tariffs. Notwithstanding what the US does domestically or how the US decides, what should EU stakeholders be aware of when it comes to the EU's reaction, retaliation to US tariffs? Is the European automotive industry, and by extension, the European automotive transition, in danger of facing some severe consequences if the EU doesn't act properly?
Right. Yes, there are a lot of dangers. Look, Trump is Trump. Can't comment on what Trump does or thinks. But what I think is important for Europe is to stay its course on decarbonization, but also on its clean energy transition, because building things here, onshoring things, will make us resilient. in view of all of that's happening in the world. My biggest concern, and that's something that we now all see as part of the current negotiations on tariffs between the EU and the US, is that it's not just about tariffs. What Trump is saying is, well, it's not about zero tariff. I want you in the EU to weaken all of your emission and safety regulations, because that's the problem. So I can sell my cars much easier in Europe. And that should be a massive no-go for the EU. We should not be weakening our world-leading safety rules. Our safety rules were actually copied by so many countries in the world, saving lives globally. We cannot be weakening those regulations just to please either Trump or, if I may say so, a few CEOs in even European car makers that just want a deal no matter what. We must remain, autonomous, and we must remain firm on our course. Going fast electric, being ambitious actually works. I would add that today the largest concern that our car makers face is not just competition from the Chinese in the European market. It's the competition in the global markets, because suddenly the Chinese cheap electric cars are attractive to everybody. People from India to Thailand to South Africa to Chile are buying them, and we no longer can sell our cars. So the faster we actually follow our regulations, the faster we go electric, the more capacity and affordable small electric cars we have, the bigger is our opportunity to remain competitive globally. Actually, going backwards will not help anyone. And this is my biggest concern, that we will be so afraid and so keen to please our car industry and Trump that we will go and roll back our regulations, and that will be the end of it.
Well, Julia, thank you so much for your time, for chatting with us on Policy Driven. Mark and I really appreciate it. And we look forward to driving forward with discussions on global transport policy with you and your colleagues. Perhaps we can have one on nationalization in the coming months.
At least one, yeah.
At least one on nationalization.
Yeah.
So yes, thank you so much, Julia. Pleasure to have you on the podcast, and we really look forward to having you back soon.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Thomas. Thanks, Mark. It was really fun chatting. This hour just absolutely ran fast.
It flew by. We learned a lot from you, Julia. Thanks so much.
No, we did. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.